This is a very important part of the seven-piece wardrobe, this washable dress that you wear in hot climates.
And it had the admiration of celebrities like Sting.
Well, it's always exciting flying supersonic, and it's always exciting to get to New York before you've left.
It was a stratospheric cocktail party.
Normally people complain about how bad the airline food is. I will attest in this case, that was not true. This was one of the best meals I ever had. It worked beautifully. A normal French meal takes 2.5, 3 hours. Well, by the time dinner was over, we were here.
So, what went wrong? On July 25th, 2000, the Concorde punctured a tire during takeoff for Air France Flight 4590. 113 people died. Though failure happened shortly after takeoff, it was due to a problem specific to Concorde tires. The plane was grounded until November of 2001. By that time, the September 11th attacks had already depressed the industry. But while both tragedies did affect Concorde, there are only a couple of pieces of the fundamental challenges for the plane. Noise levels on takeoff were high, but massive supersonic booms had no comparison. In the 60s, the Air Force ran a test of sonic booms over Oklahoma City, and residents reported hundreds of damaged windows and noise disturbances. All that meant limiting supersonic flight to above the ocean. There would be no New York to LA Concorde. That's part of what quashed the American supersonic experiment with Boeing, and it limited demand for supersonic planes from the beginning. Noise concerns were paired with environmental concerns.
There will be severe environmental damage to the ozone layer.
The plane's high flight pattern made scientists think its exhaust gas could be more threatening to the ozone than normal jets.
What was noticeable was that you kept climbing and climbing and climbing. We're flying much higher than a normal airliner.
A massive fleet of supersonic planes probably would have caused real damage, setting red flags for a supersonic future. Fuel requirements also limited range to transatlantic journeys without any trans-Pacific cash cows. It guzzled enough fuel that price fluctuations could hit particularly hard. With ticket prices as high as $12,000 a seat, that was a significant risk, and tickets had to be expensive since at most only 120 passengers could fit on the plane. It couldn't distribute the price tag. That was compounded by the need for specially qualified crew members and maintenance that came at a premium, and it was all for a very demanding crowd.
Air France and British Airways had to position a spare Concorde in New York in case the flight back had problems. So there's airplanes sitting on the ground.
We had it. From January 21st, 1976 to October 24th, 2003, we had a commercial supersonic passenger plane called Concorde. It took about 3 hours and 30 minutes, just under 3 hours if it was record time. A journey that would have taken the Titanic 137 hours had become just barely long enough to watch Titanic while crossing the Atlantic. The Concorde came to represent class, style, and the miracle of engineering. Here's a normal plane landing, and here's the Concorde landing. Which one are you looking at? With Concorde, we all looked up and pointed, and then in 2003, it stopped. We had commercial supersonic flight and just let it go. Why? Why did the Concorde become a museum exhibit? This is the Smithsonian's Concorde, and the curator who got it flew on it, too.
I did see, the color of the sky at 60,000 feet is this most gorgeous, deep, deep purple.
How did a breakthrough become a piece of memorabilia? The answer says something about how innovation really sticks, and it's complicated.
I've got a personal interest in the SST, and I'd like to tell you about it.
SST equals supersonic transport, any transportation that's faster than the speed of sound. It became a dream after Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in 1947, and a technological race in the 1950s and 1960s combined Cold War competition with a classic mid-century faith in engineering. Americans, Russians, and the British and French governments dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into supersonic R&D. Think rooms full of engineers in short sleeves and ties. The then Seattle-based Boeing won the American design contract in 1967. That's where a certain basketball team got its original name.
Supersonic win the game!
game!
But development stopped after a 1971 funding cut. Russia's effort, the Tupolev Tu-144, flew, but it was grounded after an extraordinarily spotty record over just 55 flights. But there was a winner.
Concorde, the paper dart jetliner conceived jointly by Britain and France to shrink the world and cut air journey times in half.
From the beginning, Concorde was a marvel of design. It wasn't designed with computers, but through math and trial and error. They had to innovate constantly to make a supersonic passenger plane possible.
The airplane needed to be very long and narrow to go supersonically comfortably.
And the paint was twice as reflective as other jets, just to compensate for the heat from air friction.
Because you're traveling at Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, even though you're at 60,000 feet, the airframe would actually heat up dramatically. So I actually, touched the window. It wasn't warm, it was hot.
Fuel flowed around the plane during flight to adjust its center of gravity for takeoff, cruising, and landing.
So these pumps are working the whole flight, but you can't tell.
But it was the beautiful wing that distinguished the Concorde for its greatest fans.
It's a delta wing, but it's called an ogival delta wing because of its unique shape.
Delta because it was triangular, like the Greek delta, ogival to reference its curve. The delta wing helped the Concorde get lift at takeoff and limit drag while in flight. The rest of the plane compensated.
The one compromise in it required the aircraft to have a very high angle of attack on takeoff and landing.
Since pilots couldn't see out of the plane because of angled landing, engineers put together a solution.
The Concorde featured a droop snoot.
Droop snoot?
Yeah, the snoot would droop.
The snoot drooped.
The reason being that it was a delta wing design and they had a very high angle of attack on landing. So in order to see, they were able to lower the nose.
It flew at Mach 2, more than 1,300 miles an hour, faster than the Earth spins.
You couldn't tell. The only way you knew you're doing Mach 2 was that they had a Mach meter up on the bulkhead. And everybody was focused on that because it would creep up. And as soon as it went Mach 1, everybody would break out into applause.
To minimize drag, it soared so high you could see the Earth's curve. The Concorde defined the glamour of high-speed flight.
Not making any money, just in case, because Concorde passengers expect, to walk onto a Concorde because they paid a lot of money to it.
None of these factors stopped the Concorde, but they all boxed it in until it had nowhere to go but down. When Air France and British Airways announced the Concorde's closing on April 10th, 2003, it wasn't about the past, but the future. The manufacturer, Airbus, decided supporting the Concorde was impossible. An aging Concorde, it still had analog controls and a flight engineer, both of which newer planes had lost, would cost too much to upgrade or redo. In a way, Concorde's economics were similar to this toy model's economics. I got it for $10 because the manufacturer could distribute the cost of factory workers, tooling, and distribution over thousands of cute planes. Airbus loves doing the same with its family of jets. Even if a flight were profitable for an airline, the airline couldn't afford a new small batch of airplanes. All the factors that boxed in Concorde kept its scale so small it would be wildly unprofitable to service, rebuild, or revive. The best option was to land for good.
On a sunny Tuesday afternoon, on the northeastern outskirts of Paris, 100 passengers began the boarding process onto the world's fastest commercial plane. Navigating down the narrow body of the Concorde with pairs of business class seats flanking them on each side. Flight 4590 was a chartered flight, carrying the predominantly German passengers to embark on an adventurous journey through the Caribbean, the Panama Canal, and finally Ecuador aboard the MS Deutschland. The crew of the flight was composed of the captain, a 53-year-old pilot with over 300 hours flown in the Concorde. The first officer was a 50-year-old with over 2,000 hours of Concorde flight time, and the flight engineer who again accumulated over 900 hours of flying with the Concorde. At 2:34 p.m., ground control gave clearance for the flight to take off from runway 26R the longest runway at Charles de Gaulle Airport, which was needed to get the Concorde's cumbersome delta wings up to takeoff speed. At 2:40 p.m., flight Air France 4590 lined up at the start of runway 26R, beginning the exciting takeoff sequence, the world's only commercial plane to employ afterburners. 20 seconds later, the first officer calls out that they've reached 100 knots. 6 seconds later, the officer calls out V1, the point of no return. Aborting the takeoff now was no longer an option, as there was not enough runway left to stop in time. A mere 2 seconds later, a loud crash is heard from the left wing, and flames are seen billowing from the plane, crashing just moments later into a nearby hotel. What followed was a multi-year air crash investigation, unraveling the cause of the accident from the wreckage using engineering. This is its story. The challenge facing air crash investigators for any tragic loss like this is immense. The Concorde had crashed into a small hotel and restaurant almost 10 kilometers southwest of Charles de Gaulle Airport. Flames had consumed the area around the crash site, leaving the investigators a scattered and scorched debris field to piece back together. The investigators started by organizing the accident site to discover clues about what had happened. Clipped trees north of the hotel crash site suggested that the plane had crashed while heading south. Following along that southward trajectory, the ruins of the Concorde's powerful turbojet engines were scattered on the darkened, burnt ground. The site was littered with large impact marks with pieces of fuselage embedded in the ground. Further south, the main cabin was found, alongside the tragic victims of the crash. To the east lay the cockpit and its burned instruments. Not all of the instruments survived the flames, and many of them were missing. However, a few instruments did survive the crash and the heat. The investigators noted down the final readings on the dials they could read. This would hopefully provide crucial information that would lead to a revelation as the investigation continued. As they dug through the remains of the aircraft, they found the flight data recorder, the tool that stores critical data about the plane's flight record. They also found the cockpit voice recorder, allowing the investigators to listen to the plane's final moments. In these audio recordings, a large bang is heard, shortly after the officer called out V1. At the same moment, the flight data recorder displayed a sudden loss of speed and thrust in engine number 2 on the left wing, followed closely by its neighbor, engine 1. While engines 1 and 2 were struggling, the data showed that the plane kept flying with an almost constant angle of attack without gaining altitude, while the loss of thrust on the left wing caused the plane to roll. This flight data and the audio recordings provided a lot of evidence as to what had happened, but it left a crucial question unanswered. What was that loud noise that preceded the fire, and what caused it? To find more clues, the investigators turned their attention to the runway. Even without the data recordings, the scorched concrete painted a vivid picture of the Concorde's final moments. It was clear from the burned grass and damaged lights that the Concorde had lost control and veered to the left, while irregular marks in the concrete and chunks of rubber pointed to a left tire failure. Along the charred trail, the plane left more breadcrumb clues crucial to continuing the investigation. Besides the damaged rubber tire, 2 other items stood out to the investigation: a mysterious titanium strip with irregular drilled holes and an unscorched piece of the plane no larger than a sheet of printer paper. They were perplexed by that thin metal strip. Irregular drilled holes are not very common in the industry. This led to investigators trying to match the 42-centimeter long strip to any component of the Concorde, but they couldn't find a match for it anywhere in the design documents. They concluded that this strip was not part of the plane and had been there before the plane took off. Logically, the next step was to scrutinize all of the departing flights on the same runway to identify where this metal strip could have come from. Flight 4590 left at 2:30 p.m. They scoured through all of the maintenance and engineering documents for any plane that took off after 1 p.m. One of the many papers they went through pointed them in the right direction. A McDonnell Douglas DC-10 that was servicing a continental flight that left a mere 5 minutes before the Air France flight had a maintenance document referencing a metallic wear strip. The maintenance documents showed that the plane had undergone repairs of a metal wear strip just 1 month prior in Tel Aviv. The same document showed that the maintenance was not up to manufacturing standards. To confirm, the investigators tracked down the DC-10 and found it was missing a wear strip with the same irregular drilled holes. The culprit's fingerprints had been matched to the scene of the crime. The investigators concluded that a few minutes before Flight 4590 was due to depart, the Continental flight dropped its wear strip on the runway. Crucially, a 32-centimeter long cut was found in the rubber tire debris left on the runway. While it was tempting to connect this 42-centimeter long metal strip and the cut found in the tire, the investigators could not assume it was the cause. To confirm, investigators built a simulated Concorde, a wagon modified to fit a new Concorde tire, loaded with 25 tons to simulate the weight of the aircraft. And indeed, the strip cut the tire exactly as seen in the crash debris. However, this only answers why a tire would burst. Crucially, this does not answer how a tire burst would cause the eventual fiery crash. After all, this crash was not the first time the Concorde suffered a burst tire during takeoff. During its 30-year program, the Concorde experienced 57 tire malfunctions. 22 of these events happened during takeoff and 19 were caused by a foreign object. In 12 of these events, structural damage was seen and 6 experienced fuel tank penetrations, but none caused a fire like the one seen on Flight 4590. One event in particular stands out. On the 14th of June 1979, an Air France Concorde took off from Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C., heading to Paris. During the takeoff, one of the tires burst and caused punctures in 3 of the tanks. This led to fuel being leaked at a rate of 4 kilograms per second. Luckily, the crew noticed the damage, and 24 minutes after takeoff, they landed safely back at Dulles Airport. In the report that followed this incident, it was stated that the risk of fire was low after penetration of the tanks. They stated that the low rate of fuel leakage, coupled with scarce ignition sources, did not pose a significant risk of fire. They also stated that even in the event of a leak, the location of the tanks would cause the fuel to disperse rather than accumulate. The images and videos of the Concorde in flames play in stark contrast to the findings from this previous investigation. This, of course, begs the question, what was different about this flight that led to this infamous picture? To answer that question, the investigators needed to quantify the fuel leak rate of Flight 4590. Visual evidence that came from videos and images of the crash provided the first clues. Using these images, the investigators could estimate the dimensions of the flames trailing behind the Concorde's wing, gauging the flame to be 50 meters long, 3 meters in diameter, and 10 centimeters thick. They could estimate the rate of fuel leak needed to sustain such a blaze at 60 kilograms per second. One of the instruments that survived the crash confirmed this number. With the initial fuel load known, some simple calculations confirmed the fuel leak at a rate of 60 kilograms per second using the fuel dial, still stuck in its final position, 15 times greater than the 4 kilogram per second leak witnessed in the previous incident at Dulles Airport. This points to a very different fuel leak mechanism. Here is where the third piece of evidence from the runway helped the investigators solve the mystery of the crash. A single 30 centimeter by 30 centimeter piece of tank was found on the runway. This piece held the secrets to what happened. To an untrained eye, this piece of metal wouldn't stand out. Coated in the Concorde's white, heat-resistant paint on one side and strengthening struts running along its length on the other. This was enough detail to pinpoint exactly where in the plane it came from. Tank number 5, right above the landing gear. Next, the investigators noted that the piece was not burned at all, indicating that it dropped before the fire started. To crack the final piece of the puzzle, the investigators needed a material science expert. To an untrained eye, the fracture surface of a metal tells you little, but to an expert in fracture mechanics, it tells a story. The investigators' report noted that the ruptures in the thin skin were matte for the most part. The rupture face was angled at 45 degrees, which indicates that these were static ruptures. To understand the significance of this passage, we need some background on fracture mechanics. Why does a 45-degree rupture face indicate a static rupture? Let's run a couple of examples with different materials undergoing different types of stress and see how their fracture geometries vary. The investigators knew that the type of aluminium being used in the tank was a ductile material. If we take a ductile material and apply stress to it, as its name implies, the material sample would deform as the load increases. This leads to a phenomenon called necking, where the material thins out until it can't stand a larger load and then fails. This leaves a characteristic 45-degree angle on the failed piece. Often in these types of failures, you can see a cup and ball surface, again at a 45-degree angle. These types of surfaces only happen to ductile materials under tension. If another type of stress would be applied to the sample, say torsional stress, then the material would break with a 90-degree angle. Examining the fracture surface of this piece told the experts working on this case a story. The hole in the tank wasn't caused by a puncture by the tire physically piercing the tank. It pointed towards a rupture caused by a buildup of pressure inside the tank. The piece of rubber hit the underside of the wing with enough force to cause a deformation in the tank, causing the walls of the tank to bend in while adjacent sections bulged out. This was a serious problem because the fuel was incompressible, and being the start of the flight, the tanks were full. The resulting pressure wave slammed down into the bulging sections and ejected the piece of tank found on the runway. And a hole this large was capable of causing a fuel leak large enough to match the flames seen in the images of the tragic accident. The scene was set. A poorly positioned metal strip caused a stressed tire to burst and slam against the underside of the wing, which in turn led to a massive pressure wave inside the tank, which ruptured the tank, leading to a catastrophic and tragic loss of power, leading to the plane's uncontrollable descent. A decade-long legal battle ensued between Air France and Continental, where they took turns pointing fingers at each other, finalizing in a 2010 court ruling that fined Continental €1 million. Plans were made to add Kevlar liners to the fuel tanks to prevent further static ruptures like this, and potential electric ignition sources were also moved and reinforced in the area. New, damage-resilient tires were also introduced. However, these modifications meant little for the financially struggling Concorde. This crash proved to be the final nail in the coffin for the airline. With high ticket prices and low demand for flights becoming even lower in the wake of the crash, the Concorde proved to be financially unviable, leading to both British Airways and Air France to cancel their supersonic flying programs, the end of an era marked by a tragic crash. I hesitated making this video for YouTube, as it deals with a tragic accident and it's not always clear what will and won't upset the YouTube demonetization system. That's why I moved all my World War II related content to Nebula, where I can continue making videos about a subject I am passionate about without having to worry about YouTube views. Between my Logistics of D-Day and Battle of Britain series, I have over 3 hours of documentaries you can watch right now. This isn't like the same old boring history documentaries being remade over and over again these days, repeating themselves constantly for their 30-minute runtimes so they can fit enough ads in. This is in-depth research distilled into 3 hours of entertaining and informative documentaries. The same nitty-gritty detail you've come to enjoy from real engineering, just applied to a different genre. We will also be sharing additional content from our upcoming documentary about spin launch in the coming month, as we have hours of footage that will end up on the cutting room floor without a suitable place to share it. We are just one of the creators using Nebula to experiment and make videos that may not work on YouTube. There is Real Life Lore's Modern Conflict series, Wendover Productions game show that I competed in, where you will see some of my usual day-to-day chaotic personality that I desperately try to hide from you on this channel. Nebula is not just the home of extra videos. It's a proving ground for new ideas and concepts that helps us as content creators to experiment and develop our skills. Skills that have bled into these videos with our 3D animation abilities growing thanks to the Battle of Britain series. On top of all that, the best and cheapest way to get access to Nebula is by signing up to CuriosityStream for the low price of $14.79 a year. That will get you access to CuriosityStream's massive library of award-winning documentaries and get Nebula bundled in for free. You can sign up with the link on screen right now, or if you're looking for something else right now, you can watch our last video about SpaceX's new rocket fuel, or watch Real Science's latest video explaining why crows are so smart.
This is the Concorde, a legendary supersonic passenger aircraft that could fly faster than the speed of sound and cruise at twice the speed of conventional airliners today, traveling at 1,350 miles per hour, fast enough to cross the Atlantic Ocean in just under 3.5 hours. The Concorde soared at altitudes of up to 60,000 feet, allowing passengers to see the curvature of the Earth while traveling. Today, we're exploring the unique features of this supersonic airliner and how it works. Let's get into it. The Concorde was born from an ambitious partnership between Britain's BAC and France's Aerospatiale in the 1960s. After a decade of development, the Concorde entered service in 1976, primarily operated by British Airways and Air France. The Concorde stretched 202 feet long, had a wingspan of 84 feet, and stood 40 feet tall. The Concorde's most recognizable feature was its delta wing design, a triangular shape without a separate horizontal stabilizer. The Concorde had to approach the runway at a much steeper angle of around 16 degrees compared to 3 degrees for normal planes. This steep approach was necessary because delta wings only generate sufficient lift at high angles of attack when flying slowly. The Concorde featured a mechanized nose that could drop by 12.5 degrees to provide the pilot a clear view of the runway during high angle of attack maneuvers. This mechanism had 4 positions. The top position is a fully retracted position used during supersonic flight. The second position lowers a specialized heat shield visor that protects the cockpit from the intense heat of supersonic travel. The third position is a 5-degree down position used for takeoffs and taxis to improve pilot visibility. And the final setting drops the nose even further into a 12.5-degree position, necessary for landing at high angles of attack. The Concorde also had a small tail bumper wheel, not typically used, but designed to protect the rear fuselage and engines during steep takeoff and landing angles. The Concorde's interior layout maximized efficiency in a narrow fuselage while still maintaining luxury. At the front sits the cockpit with 4 seats: the captain, first officer, flight engineer, and a jump seat for observers or trainers. Behind this is a compact lavatory and galley area, followed by the forward passenger cabin with 40 luxury seats arranged in a 2-2 configuration. Midway through the fuselage are 2 more lavatories, while the rear section houses an additional 60 passenger seats. At the very back is another galley for meal preparation during the relatively short supersonic journeys. The Concorde's engines are mounted under the wings, 4 mighty Rolls-Royce Necma Olympus 593 turbojets, some of the most advanced jet engines ever built for supersonic travel. These engines were engineering marvels, each capable of producing a staggering 38,000 pounds of thrust with afterburners engaged. Here's how they worked. Like all jet engines, air is drawn in through the intake, compressed to extremely high pressure by compressor blades, mixed with fuel and ignited in the combustion chamber, then expelled as hot gases to generate thrust. For additional power, especially during takeoff and acceleration to supersonic speeds, Concorde employed afterburners. Extra fuel was sprayed into the hot exhaust stream, igniting a secondary combustion that acted like a rocket stage, boosting thrust and helping the aircraft break the sound barrier. Afterburners increased thrust by 26%, creating that dramatic burst of extra thrust needed to push through the sound barrier. This technology, taken from military fighters, was key to reaching supersonic speeds. The Concorde had 13 separate fuel tanks dispersed throughout its delta wings, holding an impressive 119,000 liters of fuel. The Concorde could fly around 7,200 kilometers on a full tank at an incredible speed, but it was extremely fuel hungry, burning about 25,000 liters every hour. These fuel tanks also played a vital role in controlling the plane. As Concorde accelerated toward Mach 2, the center of pressure on its wings, the point where a lift effectively acts, tends to move backward, shifting rearward by up to 1.8 meters. While this kind of shift isn't a big deal for slower commercial jets, at supersonic speeds, it could create serious control problems. Without compensation, the aircraft could risk a dangerous nosedive. To prevent this, Concorde used a clever fuel management system. As speed increased, fuel was gradually transferred from forward trim tanks to rear trim and collector tanks in the wings. This movement of up to 20 tons of fuel shifted the center of gravity backward, aligning it with the new center of pressure. The result? A perfectly balanced aircraft, even at twice the speed of sound. The Concorde was more than just an airplane. It was a symbol of innovation, elegance, and ambition. It pushed the boundaries of what was possible in commercial aviation, combining advanced engineering with breathtaking speed. Though it retired in 2003, the legacy of the Concorde still captures imaginations today, inspiring a new generation of supersonic flight. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and the bell so you're notified when I post new content. Stay connected and be part of the journey. Follow Learn from the Base. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned a lot, and I'll see you next time.